Ambassador Melville, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Christiane. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I mean, there couldn't be a more opportune time to be speaking to you, and we're very grateful to have you because, as I laid out, there is so much to talk about right now. First, in context of your own resignation and your own professional reasons for doing so, what do you make of an even more senior diplomat, a cabinet member, Nikki Haley, US UN ambassador, sudden resignation, sudden departure? Of course, it's effective at the end of this year.
Right. Well, let me say, first of all, that as ambassador in Tallinn, when the Trump administration took office last January, for diplomats, words are like our fuel. And the fact that Secretary of State Tillerson chose not to engage with the press and went many, many weeks without doing the press briefings or talking to journalists, it was like being deprived of oxygen. And in those days, I was very grateful that Ambassador Haley spoke eloquently and frequently about the best interests of the United States and stood up for our institutions and values. I think she did a very credible job as UN ambassador. And so I think it's a shame that somebody who is so talented and really has the president's confidence has left the administration, but I'm sure that she hasn't left the public stage, and perhaps she'll be able to engage a little bit more freely as a private citizen about her opinions and sticking up for our institutions.
Oh, that's interesting. I see a sort of maybe a coded message that you think, like many at the UN, in fact, that she was always eyeing a public run for public office in the United States, and this was an important vehicle that, by all accounts, she acquitted herself well doing this job. What impact on foreign policy do you think it will have, given your immediate concerns about, the denigration, as you put it, of allies and alliances, the praise and sort of, the praise of authoritarian regimes?
Well, it's kind of a strange thing that most of the institutions are Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, still speaks for our institutions and our interests. And I think, for the most part, the message is consistent with what have been our policies for many, many decades. What I came to really have a hard time with was the ahistorical rhetoric of the president himself and the disconnect between his words and what other leaders were saying became more and more difficult for me to explain and understand.
Okay, just quickly, fill in those blanks there. What do you mean, the disconnect between his words and what other leaders were saying? Just fill in those blanks for me.
Well, it started for me. I remember I was the U.S. ambassador in Estonia. Estonia, in the last 300 years, Estonia has spent 250 of them occupied by Russia. So there is a great sensitivity to their neighbor to the east. And the solution to that geographic challenge that they faced throughout their history was to embed themselves in the institutions of the West. Mm-hmm. These are the institutions that the United States built and led for many decades, and primarily that means NATO. During the campaign, when candidate Trump was saying that NATO is obsolete, and in fact, one of his advisors, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, was on television saying that, perhaps Estonia wasn't worth defending because it's a suburb of St. Petersburg. Mm-hmm. It put me in a very difficult position when they took office. Mm-hmm. So I was looking right from the start for the administration to reassure our allies and return to the traditional rhetoric and language of American leadership regarding our fealty to NATO and the institutions that we belong to and lead. And our allies were looking for that. Mm-hmm. So that was really important. And there were many, many leaders of the U.S. institutions and government in the legislative branch, in the executive branch, who came to Tallinn with messages of reassurance. And it was a very important part of my job to bring that message to the Estonians that the United States was true to our institutions, that Article 5 was our commitment, and we would continue to live by the promises that we'd made to our allies.
Ambassador, you mentioned what President Trump or his campaign advisor said during the campaign. Actually, the president himself, around the NATO summit this year, made similar comments about Montenegro. Why should I send, my son or anybody's to fight to defend Montenegro? We're going to get to that in a moment. But I want to also ask you what you think should be the appropriate U.S. response to the disappearance of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who obviously is a Saudi, and as we all know, Saudi Arabia and the current Crown Prince is a firm ally of President Trump's. President Trump made his first visit as president to Saudi Arabia. We are just getting word that the president has said that he is speaking and has spoken to the highest levels of the Saudi government, but we don't know any more details. What should the United States do in this case with an ally so close?
Well, first of all, we should insist on knowing the truth. Mr. Khashoggi was a prominent journalist and spoke for many in Saudi Arabia, and his opinions mattered. And for any government to assassinate, as has been alleged, a leading journalist is a tragedy and a serious threat to international order. And we need to know what the truth is. And the Saudis owe us that truth.
Of course, we have to say that in each occasion when we ask for the Saudis to comment publicly, they haven't come on television, but they send us statements. And the latest is that they continue to categorically, and I use that word because it's theirs, deny any involvement in this and say that they're trying to work it out themselves. Well, what I said at the beginning of the program was, do you believe, having said what you just said, that it's up to the US to speak out very, very vociferously, to demand the truth, to demand accountability? Do you think, given what you think about this president and his tendency towards these strongmen rulers, is there a sense of permission to act with impunity, that they might subliminally take from their relationship with the president and from what he says in public?
Well, one of the things that I find most horrifying is the idea that the press and the media are the enemy of the people. For those of us who speak Russian and have served in that part of the world, those are particularly loaded terms. And I believe that the role of journalists such as yourself is so important in defending our institutions and preserving our democratic order. So Mr. Khashoggi, being a journalist and a member of the profession, his fate is tied to why it is so important that we have freedom of the press, and we do value that promise in our Constitution. And I do not understand why facts and good journalism are perceived as being against the interests of the United States or the institutions.
So let me put this to you. There is a group now, a mounting group of American foreign policy experts, former ambassadors and others, who are beginning to write major books and scholarly works, trying to figure out America's global role right now. And they're coming down on the sort of conclusion that America is abandoning its leadership role, particularly in the alliances and the moral imperative in human rights that you've been speaking about. Bob Kagan is one of those. He's more of a conservative thinker. But about this issue on Khashoggi, he said, sometimes a particular event, the fate of a particular individual, becomes a symbol of a global historical trend. The reported murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a Post contributor, in a consulate in Istanbul, is one of those moments. It symbolizes the departure of the United States as a restraining force against evil actors in the world. So there is no U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia right now. That's one big issue that seems to be a gaping hole. But do you agree with what Kagan says, that, it symbolizes the departure of the United States as a restraining force against evil actors in the world?
Christian, Bob is an old friend and a very wise observer. I absolutely do agree with what he said. And it's very important for those of us who have a platform to repeatedly stress the importance of our commitment to our values, human rights, free journalism. These are the things that should drive how the United States engages with the rest of the world, including Saudi leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So to hold them to account for what happened in that consulate in Istanbul is in keeping with the best interests of the United States.
So again, all these things you're saying and all these recommendations that you're saying for this administration presumably add up to the reason why you quit, why you resigned, not just your post, but from the Foreign Service.
Well, I had a long career. I had by most lights, a successful career. In fact, the administration had nominated sometime before I left someone to replace me. His nomination was withdrawn at the end of May, and I was given the option to stay on. But I had managed to get through the 6 months that Estonia had the presidency of the EU, which was very important to our ally, and they did a wonderful job with those responsibilities. And it was also a platform that I could use to engage with Washington at a little bit higher attention level because of Estonia's role. Mm-hmm. And then in February, Estonia celebrated its 100th anniversary of independence, and there was a Baltic summit with the presidents of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in the White House on April 3rd. So I had almost 3 years in Tallinn when I was facing that decision of whether I should stay or go. But it was increasingly difficult. As I said in my op-ed and in my Facebook post in June, to explain or understand the difference between the president's language and the language that was coming out of the rest of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
government.
So let me.
So I decided to leave. I did not plan originally to be quite so public, but it was when the president went on the attack against NATO directly and the EU that I felt the better choice for me was to leave so that I could have conversations with people like you about how we can do better and how I want the president to succeed. It's in every American's interest that we have a successful administration and a president who can do the job well.
Oh, I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that in a moment, but first I want to ask you this, because again, it's being raised by some more conservative thinkers and activists in the United States in the wake of Nikki Haley's resignation, that there needs to be a robust America First candidate who gets the job of the next UN ambassador. But you have written that in this op-ed that you described, that America First is a sham. So you talked about what you've just been talking about, the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House on NATO and other such alliances. When you say America First is a sham and the president is busy saying that he's racking up all sorts of victories that make America First, and as you heard, Nikki Haley said, in the 2 years that I've been here, the 2 years of the Trump administration, the world may not like us so much, but they certainly respect us. Why do you say it's a sham?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the United States is and has always been respected by our allies and adversaries, and that does not change from one administration to the other. I have spent better than 30 years as a nonpartisan, apolitical diplomat, and when it comes to relations in the world, international affairs, how we face the global challenges, it seems to me that, as Senator Vandenberg said a long time ago, politics stop at the water's edge. And whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, when it comes to the rest of the world, you're not adversaries, you're teammates. And your rhetoric should reflect a commitment to our Constitution, our institutions, our values. And I just think that we have a president who, for some reason, has an agenda that is, at least in terms of the language, that's in opposition to the role of a president of the United States, as I have understood it to be.
You know, it's really
my model for
yeah.
my model for the. I mean, in my 33 years, I think you could make a very strong argument for George H.W. Bush as being the model leader in terms of how to engage with our allies and our adversaries and the global community. You want people who lead, and listen, we're all human beings. Every political leader in every country is a human being. And when they are disrespected and their role is denigrated, it makes it harder for them in their own political world to stand by our side. And you want to make it easy for them to say, yes, you're right, the United States has a point, I'm happy to stand with my ally. But when you throw candy at the Chancellor of Germany or use hostile rhetoric against, good Lord, the Prime Minister of Canada, it's very hard to understand and explain.
But what about when you make up or make nice with the leader of North Korea, which was busy testing nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles? I mean, what about that? He claims that the whole tone and the temperature has been dramatically reduced because of his style and his efforts.
Well, I think it's absolutely true that the hostility and the temperature has been turned down. And so in that regard, you know, I can't argue with the president that his personal engagement with the North Korean leader has brought about good results. And but you know, that's an example of what I'm talking about. You know, in that regard, the president's rhetoric tracks more traditionally with the approach that I think a successful president should have regarding leaders of other countries, and much better for them to be talking than for him to be calling him Little Rocket Man.
Mm-hmm. Just a very final question. You know, you talked about the Tillerson era, and of course now it's the Pompeo era at the State Department. There have been a lot of high-profile departures on matters of policy and principle, and there are still a lot of ambassadorships and other key positions unfilled. Mm-hmm. They're being filled more rapidly now. Do you see a change for the better in terms of pursuing American global leadership around the world in the Pompeo State Department?
Yes, Christiane, I do. I think Secretary of State Pompeo is doing a good job. And I think by returning to a more traditional approach to the vacancies and our responsibilities, it's very much tracking with what our best interests are. And I wish my colleagues who are still in the State Department all the best. Their success is important for America.
Well, we are very much appreciative of your insights. Thank you very much for giving us this, your first interview, on a really important day as we try to really sink our teeth into all these foreign policy challenges. Ambassador James Melville, thanks for joining us.